The last god fell just before dawn. Kim Yuwon stood at the summit of the tower, and there was nothing left to protect. The ground beneath him had been scorched down to bare stone across a battlefield that stretched in every direction. The sky held no stars, only the vast, shapeless forms of the outer gods pressing in from the edges of everything, patient and enormous and entirely without mercy. Every pantheon that had stood against them was broken. Every human fighter who had climbed to this height was gone. Sun Wukong, Hercules, the high-rankers who had poured out their last reserves and fallen anyway. The outer gods had been methodical about it. Yuwon had fought until his hands forgot what rest felt like. He stood in the silence and understood with cold clarity what this was. Not a setback. Not something reversible with better strategy or harder effort. Humanity was out of moves. The divine pantheons were out of strength. The outer gods would finish what they had started, and nothing would survive to remember that any of this had happened. Then Kronos shifted beside him. The old Titan was the last one still standing, barely, sustained by something that had stopped being willpower a long time ago. His body was coming apart, not from wounds but from deeper damage, the kind that comes when a being pushes past what they were built to endure. He did not look afraid. He looked tired in the way of someone who had already closed every door except one. He told Yuwon there was one thing left. Yuwon understood what he meant and tried to refuse. Kronos stopped him before he finished the sentence. Calm, unhurried, the way only finality allows. He was the god of time, he said. That was not something he could offer in partial amounts. To push Yuwon all the way back to the beginning, back to Earth, back to the last night before the tutorial, back to December 31st, 2019, Kronos would have to give everything. Not his power, not his divine title. His existence across every version of every timeline erased so completely that nothing in the universe would remember him at all. One ancient titan, trading himself out of history so a single human warrior could try again. The light swallowed Yuwon whole. December 31st, 2019. Hongdae, Seoul. The street was loud and bright, full of people counting down the last minutes of the year. Bar lights spilled across wet pavement. Music thumped from somewhere across the block. It smelled of street food and cold air, and the specific cheapness of a public celebration. Yuwon stood on the sidewalk and breathed it in. The city had absolutely no idea what was coming. He had 12 minutes before midnight, and he had already used them well. The bag hanging from his hand clanked as he shifted it. Salt and blades, all of it purchased from the nearest hardware store with the last of the pocket money he had been holding when time reversed. 4 kilograms of coarse salt had cost more than the knives. He paid it anyway. A group of young men near the corner had decided to pick a fight with someone smaller, the kind of low-effort cruelty that fills a night when people have nothing better to do. Their leader, bleach blonde, silver chain, loose posture of someone used to there being no consequences, shoved Yuwon by the shoulder as he passed and demanded to know what he was staring at. Yuwon set the bag down. It hit the pavement with a heavy, metallic clank. He told the young man, quietly and without heat, that he should find somewhere else to be before midnight. Something in his voice made the blonde hesitate. Not fear exactly, more like the sensation of having suddenly misjudged the weight of a thing. He took half a step back despite himself. Yuwon picked up the bag and moved on. He had a rooftop to find. What the system called a tutorial, Yuwon thought of as a gauntlet built to kill the unprepared. A survival trial that kicked off the tower's selection process. Quarantine the district, fill the streets with monsters, count who came through. The first phase was simple on paper. Kill 100 zombies. Everyone else scrambled. They found barricades, screamed for allies, fashioned weapons out of whatever they could grab in the first panicked minutes. Yuwon climbed to a rooftop and went to work. He knew exactly where clusters would form in this district. He knew these particular zombie variants had a weakness to salt-coated blades that tripled kill speed. He knew how to draw a crowd from height and thin it without breaking rhythm. The knowledge came from a version of this night he had already lived through, a timeline where all of it had ended in ash and ruin despite the effort. The 10th minute passed. His counter cleared 100. Final tally, 3,214 points. First place, one of the other survivors, a young man with bandaged hands who had killed 14 zombies and considered that a solid result, asked him how he had done it. Yuwon said salt worked on these ones. The young man looked down at his wounds and said nothing. The second tutorial arrived before anyone had recovered from the first. The safe zone began to shrink. A collapsing perimeter designed to herd players toward a central confrontation. Tighter and tighter, until the monsters that mattered came to you. The obvious move was to hold the interior and fight whatever the system funneled toward you. Yuwon went underground. The subway tunnels beneath the district were dense with insect monsters, multi-legged things with compound eyes that caught every stray reflection. Other players called them a death trap. Yuwon walked into the nearest entrance and started working his way toward the breeding nests. Underground kills were worth 3 times the surface rate. He had the tunnels entirely to himself. He moved fast and precise, conserving energy the way a long campaign teaches you to, no wasted motion, no dramatic finishing moves, nothing that costs more than it needs to. 2 hours in, deep enough that the surface noise was gone, the system registered a threshold, level 20. And with it, the first real unlock. Arcane power opened as a core attribute. Yuwon spent a significant portion of his accumulated points without hesitating and purchased the skill called Monkey Eyes, officially a trajectory reading tool, a prediction system for physical attacks. The listed description did not capture what it would eventually become. He had walked that evolution road before and knew exactly what conditions it required. He pocketed the remaining points and went deeper. The mother worm lived at the sector's core. Most groups met her as a desperate last resort, a colossal burrowing creature with armored segments and a crown of toxic bristles, drawn to the surface when she sensed weakness in her territory. She surfaced when groups were already ground down. Yuwon was not ground down. He met her rested, with her movement patterns catalogued from memory, and used the space correctly. The fight lasted under 6 minutes. She caught him once with her tail sweep and fractured a rib on his left side, faster than he had remembered her being, but he came out of it. His points total jumped significantly. What mattered more than points was confirmation. The tutorial system in this timeline ran on the same parameters he knew, same rules, same hidden paths, same exploits. The knowledge settled into him like ballast. Tutorial 3 brought a different kind of problem. Each sector had a system-appointed administrator, an overseer with authority to hand down rewards, mediate disputes, and enforce the rules. Most players treated them as neutral arbiters. Yuwon started watching the one in this sector within the first hour. The man moved wrong. He hovered near certain players and avoided others with too much deliberateness. His guidance always happened to steer the strongest competitors away from the highest value zones. Small things individually, each one explainable. Together they added up to a structure Yuwon recognized immediately. He had seen Olympian proxy operations before. He knew the shape. He waited for the quiet window between events, and spent a substantial portion of his accumulated points on a function no other player seemed to know existed, a direct summons request to the chief administrator of the tutorial system. The system charged a steep rate. He paid it. The response came almost immediately. A figure appeared, not the local overseer, but something that occupied space differently, something with an authority that pressed against the senses without doing anything visible. The chief administrator looked at Yuwon without warmth and asked what he wanted. Yuwon pointed at the sector overseer and explained, point by point and without embellishment, exactly what he had observed. The overseer's expression moved through shock, indignation, a brief flash of calculation, and then nothing at all as the chief administrator turned toward him. The entire process took approximately 4 seconds. The overseer ceased to be a factor in this or any other tutorial sector. Yuwon received his reward, an S-rank passive skill called Master of Mana, continuous arcane regeneration, amplification of existing techniques, and the ability to absorb ambient mana from defeated monsters and concentrated energy sources. He had forgotten how foundational this felt at the start of the climb, before everything else had been layered on top. He filed it away and started calculating the next move. Tutorial 3 also had a gate with a deadline. Every sector ran the same basic framework. Reach the kill quota, clear the gate, proceed. The whole structure assumed players wanted through as fast as possible. Yuwon intended to miss the gate entirely. The protocol for a missed deadline was called Sector Annihilation, a penalty scenario. The gate seals, fire fills the sector, and a single high-tier boss drops in to eliminate whatever remains inside. The system designed it as a deterrent. Players called it a death sentence. Yuwon had planned to miss the gate from the moment he entered the sector. He spent 3 days running systematic hunts through every subzone, accumulating essences, condensed energy dropped by killed monsters, until he had stockpiled over 1,000. When other players ran low on supplies near the deadline window, he sold to them in bulk, not out of charity but at a premium that pushed his points total to 167,000. The gate sealed, the sky turned red, and Surtur came down. The boss that dropped into the sealed sector was a flame demon, not a construct of ordinary fire but something made of it, fire organized around a form that was enormous, even by the tutorial's scaled standards. The heat arrived before his shape did, a physical wave that drove the remaining players into walls and corners. Most of them had already stopped trying. Yuwon did not move back. He had designed this specifically. The Monkey Eyes' evolved form, the Gray Eyes, the Cinder Eyes, required annihilation-grade fire as a catalyst. Not ordinary flame, the kind that pushes a body to its structural limits and forces an adaptation response. Sun Wukong had survived a divine furnace once and emerged fundamentally changed. The principle was the same. He ran toward the flame. It hit him in a way no amount of preparation fully accounts for. The heat was not just external. It pressed against his arcane power from the inside and tried to collapse it inward. He held it in anyway, let the resistance burn through him rather than retreating, felt the monkey eyes processing at the absolute edge of their capacity as they strained toward the threshold. He vomited from the systemic pressure, went to one knee, forced himself upright. Surtur fell. When the smoke cleared and his vision stabilized, the eyes had changed. The Cinder Eyes sat behind his face and saw differently. Attack trajectories, illusion boundaries, the hidden seams where constructed barriers were structurally weakest. A perception upgrade that vastly outpaced its official description and would matter considerably in the floors to come. Surtur had also dropped a giant's heart, dense and warm in his palm, pulsing with a biology that had nothing to do with human physiology. He stored it carefully and moved on. Tutorial 5 dropped him onto a sinking island, Baragonda Island, a rocky platform rising from dark water, surrounded by players transported from other sectors without warning. The system called this phase a United World Raid, pushing participants from different regions into a shared scenario. The island was descending at a measurable rate, and a visible timer was counting down for everyone to see. Most players were arguing about evacuation logistics. Yuwon went underwater. He located the parasite below the foundation, a creature buried in the bedrock, actively dissolving the structural supports from inside. It was built to absorb frontal damage. He came at it from the side, found the connection node, and severed it cleanly. The island stopped sinking 12 minutes before the timer expired. When he surfaced, a tall young man with bright hair and an outfit that had somehow survived multiple fights without losing any of its ambition walked directly toward him and introduced himself before Yuwon had finished wringing water from his sleeve. His name was Hargan. He was the son of Zeus and Hera. He had ranked first in every trial he had entered, and he relayed this as a reasonable summary of his capabilities. He asked Yuwon's name with the ease of someone extending a courtesy between peers. Yuwon gave it and thought about the giant's heart. Hargan was not easy to think around. He had too much presence for that. Not obnoxious, but relentlessly forward, the quality built in someone who had spent a lifetime being exceptional without once encountering a reason to reassess it. He mentioned again that he had ranked first in the current trial. Yuwon noted internally that he had in fact ranked second. He did not say this. What he needed to do was consume the giant's heart, and the window was narrowing. He found a private alcove off the main platform, braced against the stone wall, and ate it. What followed was 11 hours he would not choose to relive. Giant blood runs lethally hot for human biology without specific protection in place. The Cinder Eyes provided suppression. Not immunity, suppression. The heart tried to rewrite his physical baseline from the inside, and his body objected at considerable length. He vomited twice. His arcane output collapsed to near zero twice, and each time the internal fire surged without suppression and he had to drag the eyes back into control before the damage became irreversible. Both times was exactly as many times as he had. By morning, his body had accepted the new terms. He stood, and the movement was different, heavier and faster simultaneously, a density to the muscle that had not been there the night before. He raised one arm, and let a fraction of the new biology flow through it. The arm grew. Giant class mass, limited to one limb by his current vitality ceiling. One limb was enough for most situations. He found Hargan on the main platform and told him there was a hidden room they needed to reach. The fourth sector of the tutorial existed off every official map, accessible through a sequence that appeared in no documentation and that Yuwon had memorized from a lifetime he no longer lived in. Inside was not a monster. Inside was a man, middle-aged, in plain clothes, seated in a modified boss chamber as if he had arranged the furniture himself. His name was Sheldon, a black mage, a practitioner of a specific and thoroughly illegal form of corrupted power who had been caught operating 50 floors above this tutorial and sentenced to serve time as a punishment boss. He had, in the intervening years, made himself comfortable and developed a skill called Black Coffin. The Black Coffin enclosed targets in barriers of dark energy that were, at any power level accessible to tutorial participants, structurally unbreakable. Sheldon had been relying on this without complication for years. When Yuwon walked through the door, he ran a quick assessment, found him unremarkable, and deployed the coffin without ceremony. Yuwon activated gigantification on his right arm. The barrier cracked. Then it broke. Sheldon rapidly recalculated and attempted a layered variant, a more complex configuration that would take a moment to assemble. Yuwon's Cinder Eyes tracked the energy seams where each layer was thinnest. He hit those points in sequence, not randomly, but with deliberate placement, and the layers came apart one by one. The rest was brief. He walked out with the divine crystal of darkness, a black gem dense enough to feel heavier than its size warranted, pulsing with an absence of light rather than a presence of it. One of 3 divine creation fragments that existed somewhere in the tower. He held the first one in his hand now. 2 more remained, and above him, the tower stretched upward through 100 floors of trials, corrupt gods, hidden artifacts, and old enemies who had no idea what was walking toward them. He started climbing. The first floor of the tower was a world organized around combat, not the desperate chaos of the tutorials, something older and more formalized. Cities here had grown up around the great Colosseum at the floor's center, and the floor's economy ran on battle records, gladiatorial standings, and the trade in weapons and relics that serious competitors required. Players who arrived at Floor 1 were no longer fighting to survive. They were fighting to establish themselves in a system with its own internal hierarchies and power structures. Most of them had no idea how thoroughly that system had been compromised. Yuwon had one stop to make before anything else. He found the forge on the outskirts of the craftsman's district, not because it was simple to locate, but because he knew exactly where it was. A small building with no sign and a door that looked as though it hadn't been opened recently. The smoke rising from the chimney said otherwise. Inside worked the most gifted blacksmith in the history of the tower. Hephaestus had not always lived like this. In the divine hierarchy he had once held genuine prestige, the master craftsman of Olympus, the forger of weapons and artifacts that no other god could replicate. His techniques were unrepeatable. His work had built the armories of pantheons, and then he had used those techniques to forge weapons for the Gigantomachia, Olympus's war against the giant race, and watched from his own forge as those weapons turned on the allies they had been made to protect. The giants had not been enemies when the war started. They had been partners. Olympus had made promises, fought alongside them, let the alliance deepen over generations, and then, when the territorial expansion was complete and the giants' land was wanted, had ordered a massacre from behind. Cut down by their own side, with tools Hephaestus had built with his own hands and his own trust. He had refused to forge another weapon for Olympus the day he found out, so they stripped everything else from him, his title, his position, his divine standing, and left him here on the first floor for centuries, doing quiet work for quiet clients and waiting for something he had stopped expecting. Yuwon sat across from him and placed the divine crystal of darkness on the table. Hephaestus looked at it for a long moment. He asked where it had come from. Yuwon told him he'd taken it from a corrupt rancor operating as a tutorial punishment boss. The old blacksmith turned it over in his hands, ran a thumb across the surface, and was silent for nearly a full minute. Then he named the crystal's worth and what it would take to refine it properly. Yuwon told him he also wanted a blade and a glove, something built for dark mana, something that could hold the power without fracturing over extended use. The blacksmith looked at him the way craftsmen look at someone who understands the craft. He named a price. Yuwon accepted it. Hephaestus told him to come back in 10 days and to stay out of trouble until then. He was already moving back to the forge before Yuwon had risen from his chair. Hargan was waiting outside. He had followed Yuwon from the tutorial sector with the cheerful persistence of someone who had decided to be involved in something and had not yet been given a compelling reason to stop. He asked who was inside. Yuwon told him. Hargan's expression shifted. Not dramatically, but the name Hephaestus carried weight even for someone raised inside Olympus, and the weight showed. He asked why a hidden blacksmith on the first floor mattered. Yuwon told him about the Jackal Syndicate instead. The Jackals were the floor's dominant criminal organization, roughly 1,000 members distributed across the craftsmen's district and outer settlements, running extortion routes through every newcomer enclave. They operated under the direct sponsorship of an Olympian officer named Agamemnon, and their purpose was clear: identify talented young climbers, drain their tutorial earnings, and either co-opt them into service or engineer their early exit from the tower. The system had been running for years. No one on the floor had moved against it because moving against it meant moving against Olympus, and most Floor 1 residents preferred to pretend the connection wasn't there. Hargan listened with a gradually shifting expression. He asked if Yuwon was certain about Olympus's direct involvement. There was something careful in his voice that hadn't been there before, the sound of someone encountering hard evidence of a thing they had always been told did not exist. Yuwon was certain. He knew how Agamemnon worked, knew the Jackal leadership by name, knew where their main base sat and how the bribery chain ran that kept the floor's administrators from interfering. He'd seen this operational structure before, in the previous timeline, and nothing had changed. He asked Hargan whether he wanted to help dismantle it. Hargan was quiet for a beat. Then he cracked his knuckles and said he had been looking for a real test since he arrived anyway. They ran the operation in stages, which was the only way it worked. The Jackal's numbers were their primary advantage. 1,000 fighters spread across multiple districts gave them too many ways to scatter and regroup under direct pressure. The counter was to collapse that distribution before engaging. Yuwon leaked false information through 3 separate channels over 2 days. A rumor of a large cache of tutorial earnings sitting in an abandoned structure outside the main settlement, specific enough to be credible and large enough to pull the whole organization's available forces in one direction. The Jackals took the bait. Their leader, Rian, brought the bulk of his forces personally. He was not the kind of man who trusted others to handle things that mattered. Yuwon was already inside when they arrived. Hargan sealed the back. The plan was containment. Block the exits, prevent the scatter, make it a closed problem. He moved loudly when he did it, which was deliberate. The noise pulled eyes toward him while Yuwon handled the interior. Rian was a genuine fighter. Not a figurehead propped up by numbers, but someone who had built an empire on a foundation of real capability. He recognized within the first 30 seconds that he had walked into something he had badly miscalculated. And he fought the way people fight when they understand their situation and are trying to create an exit through sheer force of will. Yuwon did not let him find one. When it was over, Hargan emerged from the back with blood on his sleeve and the quiet expression of someone still processing what they had just participated in. He stood next to Yuwon in the aftermath and said nothing for a while. Then he asked if Olympus had sanctioned all of it. The robberies. The targeting of new climbers. All of it. Yuwon told him yes. That this was how Olympus operated on the lower floors. Not openly, not in ways that drew the tower's formal attention, but through proxies and manufactured disadvantages that quietly killed off anyone who might one day be a problem. Hargan had grown up inside Olympus's version of itself, the version where they were protectors and leaders, where the corruption was peripheral and the individuals responsible were exceptions rather than policy. He stood in the wreckage of Rian's operation and turned that version over in his mind. He didn't say what he found when he examined it from a new angle, but something had changed in how he held himself. Agamemnon moved faster than Yuwon had expected. 3 days before the commission was complete, the Olympian officer arrived at Hephaestus's forge with a ranker beside him. The ranker's name was Chrysis, a mid-tier fighter with gold attribute combat techniques and the comfortable confidence of someone who had spent years being the strongest person in whatever room he entered. Agamemnon carried paperwork, an official accusation of unlicensed weapons manufacturing, a warrant for Hephaestus's arrest, and a confiscation order covering everything inside the forge. The legal mechanism was real. If Hephaestus submitted to the process, there was nothing technically irregular about what Olympus was doing. Hephaestus looked at the warrant and then at Yuwon and said nothing. Yuwon stepped in front of the door. Chrysis told him to move. When Yuwon didn't, Chrysis deployed his gold attribute technique, a hardening skill that coated his strikes in dense metallic energy that had historically been sufficient to handle anything a Floor 1 player could produce. He swung. Yuwon activated gigantification on one arm and met him. The first exchange established the situation. Chrysis was significantly stronger than anything Yuwon had faced on this floor, and Yuwon was operating with real constraints. One giant limb, a vitality ceiling that limited how long he could sustain it, and the pressing tactical requirement of not moving away from the door. He could hold Chrysis. He could not dominate him. Not here, not like this. He made every exchange expensive instead. He took Chrysis's gold strikes on the giant arm rather than his core, absorbing the impacts where his vitality could absorb them. The Cinder Eyes read the attack angles and let him redirect force toward the wall rather than inward, keeping the line intact even when the defense was unsteady. The forge wall cracked twice. A shelf of completed work collapsed inside, and something ceramic shattered against the stone floor. Hephaestus heard it. His jaw tightened, but he did not come out. Chrysis was settling into his rhythm when the light changed. The Floor 1 administrator appeared without any warning at all. One moment absent, the next simply present. Standing between Chrysis and the door, with an authority that made the fight stop immediately and completely. Chrysis lowered his hands. Agamemnon went very still. What followed was not a discussion. The administrator reviewed the warrant and dismissed the unlicensed manufacturing charge on procedural grounds that Agamemnon had been too hasty to cover. He then addressed the matter of a ranked fighter using active combat techniques against a lower floor participant, a tower rule violation that carried automatic consequences regardless of stated justification. Chrysis's floor access was restricted. Agamemnon's formal authority on Floor 1 was suspended pending review. Neither man spoke during any of it. After the administrator left, Agamemnon looked at Yuwon for a long moment, not with frustration, with something colder and more patient than frustration. He turned and walked away without having said a word the entire time. Yuwon noted the look carefully. Inside the forge, Hephaestus was already assessing the damaged shelf, reorganizing what was salvageable with the methodical focus of a craftsman who has learned to work around setbacks. After a while he said, without turning around, that the commission would be finished as planned and that the repair work was not Yuwon's concern. He had never mentioned debts. Hephaestus raised it unprompted. Yuwon understood exactly what the old blacksmith was actually saying. 2 days later, Hephaestus set the completed work on the table between them. The glove was Kaini, built from 1.5 kilograms of adamantium and the refined dark crystal processed down to its essential nature and woven into the artifact's structure. It granted absolute stealth when active, drew on dark mana to amplify the wearer's existing techniques, and housed an offensive invocation, a concentrated release of dark energy called the Invocation of Hell, that Hephaestus described in the flat technical language of a man reading specifications he had written himself. Beside it sat the Twilight Blade, forged from materials Hephaestus did not elaborate on, its edge already attuned to Yuwon's arcane signature through a binding process that had taken an hour. Yuwon put on the Kaini. Something responded. The mysterious egg in his storage, the artifact he called Mosovo, origin unknown, contents still unrevealed, reacted to the void space inside the glove's containment. Its incubation percentage climbed and settled at 41. Yuwon stared at the number. Whatever was growing inside that shell had been stimulated by proximity to the Kaini's particular type of darkness. Hephaestus watched without commenting. He had the expression of someone who has seen stranger things but was making a note of this one. The Colosseum record was the next target. The great arena at the floor's center ran a standing challenge. 20 consecutive rounds of escalating combat against warrior-class opponents drawn from the floor's historical records. No one had cleared all 20 in a single session in over 1,000 years. The achievement had become part of the floor's mythology, a standard invoked when people discussed the limits of human capability, not an actual benchmark that living fighters pursued. Yuwon registered at the desk and waited to be called. The first several rounds were efficient. Real fighters with historical standing behind them. Legitimate challenges in isolation, but not calibrated for his specific combination of the Cinder Eyes, the Twilight Blade, and the combat instincts of someone who had reached the tower's apex in another lifetime. He moved through them with a controlled precision that the gathering crowd could not quite categorize. By round 14, the crowd had gone quiet. The earlier rounds had been impressive. What Yuwon was doing now was different in kind. The opponents at this stage were not historical curiosities. They were recreations of fighters who had defined what combat looked like on this floor and the floors above it. He was not handling them easily. He was reading them, adjusting mid-fight, finding the precise opening that each fighter's particular style left available, and hitting it before the window closed. His arcane reserve had fallen significantly by round 17. He felt the gap and compensated with placement. Round 20. Yamato no Orochi. The Orochi was not a warrior in the conventional sense. It was an ancient divine serpent, 8 heads, a body that occupied a substantial portion of the arena floor, and a history that stretched back further than most of the tower's formal records. 7 of its heads had been taken over the centuries by various high-ranking fighters. The 8th had not. The reverse scale on the 8th neck, a single biological vulnerability on an otherwise impenetrable creature, had been the sticking point for every attempt. Those who found it couldn't reach it before the 7th head's regeneration cycle reset the encounter. Yuwon had the Cinder Eyes. He could see the regeneration seam. He could track the 8th neck in real time and read the precise arc that would open access to the reverse scale for less than a second every 43 seconds of the engagement cycle. He spent the first 3 cycles establishing the rhythm without acting on it. He knew how it looked from the stands. He let it look however it looked. On the 4th cycle's window he moved. The strike landed with everything stacked behind it. The Twilight Blade, gigantification on the striking arm for raw mass, and his full remaining arcane output focused into one point at one moment. The sound of the impact was distinctly different from any other sound in the arena that day. The 8th head came down. Silence spread through the stands before the noise returned. Yuwon stepped back and waited for the system to register the result. The 1,000-year barrier cleared. His reward arrived immediately. Orochi's poisoned 8th heart, dense and unpleasant, pulsing with a toxicity that he stored with the specific care of something he intended to consume under controlled conditions and was not looking forward to at all. The arena system flagged his performance as a historical result and added it to the record registry. The crowd would talk about it. More importantly, the Olympian observers in the stands, and there had been several, he had noticed them before round 4, would carry the information back to people who would find it troubling. A newcomer, unknown origin, floor 1 record cleared, a head taken that their own fighters had failed to take. Let them be troubled. He had use for the attention. Floor 10 was called the Martial Realm, and it had earned the name in the specific way that places earn names, through centuries of violence organized by people who took it very seriously. The floor's territory spread across a massive mountainous landscape. At its highest peak sat Mount Paradise, home to the Celestial Demon Cult, a closed society of martial practitioners who had spent generations refining a specific and extremely powerful approach to combat, and who did not admit newcomers without testing them in ways that had historically discouraged most candidates from completing the process. Yuwon arrived at the foot of the mountain with 100 kilograms of medicinal herbs and a heart that had been sitting in his storage since the Colosseum, pulsing with a toxicity that had not diminished in transit. He needed the herbs for the same reason you need water before crossing a desert. The 8th Orochi heart was saturated with a venom that would overwhelm any system trying to process it alone, concentrated divine poison designed to destroy whatever consumed it from the inside out. The herbs were not a neutralizer. They were a buffer that bought processing time, slowed the systemic spread, and gave the body's natural resistance something to work with while the poison did everything it intended to do. He had done this before and knew exactly how unpleasant it would be. He ate the heart anyway. He spent 4 hours in a rented room off the mountain road. The vomiting started in the first 20 minutes and did not let up for the better part of 2 hours. His arcane channels discharged twice without control, scorching the floorboards near the window each time. He bled from his nose and from somewhere internal he couldn't locate without equipment he didn't have. He drank the herbs brewed in batches and forced them down between heaves, refilling the pot 6 times. What he did not do was stop. He had learned in the previous timeline that the point at which the body most wanted to give up was the 30 minutes before the process completed. By then, the pain had been running long enough to feel permanent, and something in the system started making the argument that permanent was an acceptable outcome. The argument was always wrong. He waited out the last 30 minutes on the floor, watching the wall, and then the resolution registered. Orochi's heart had been absorbed. His arcane power expanded significantly, a solid jump that he catalogued and filed. More importantly, his body now carried the condensed energy of an ancient divine serpent, which would interact with several things he intended to pursue over the next weeks in ways that accumulated well. He stood, cleaned the room as thoroughly as the circumstances allowed, and started up the mountain. The celestial demon cult's outer grounds were protected by an illusion forest. The territory looked navigable, open paths, clear sky above the canopy, no obvious threat. The spatial logic inside it ran on entirely different rules than the terrain outside it. The exit that appeared ahead of you was never the exit that mattered. Most aspirants spent 3 to 6 days in the forest before either finding a path or abandoning the attempt. Yuwon walked through in 40 minutes. The Cinder Eyes read illusion boundaries the way they read everything, as a structure with seams, with points where the constructed geometry was thinnest. The forest worked by layering false spatial logic over real terrain. The real terrain had internal rules. He followed those rules. The gatekeeper at the inner threshold stared at him for 5 full seconds when he emerged, then looked down at the log to verify the time. He wrote something, checked the time again, and sent word up the mountain. Word came back quickly. Vice Captain Jeryong would meet the new arrival in person. Yuwon knew what this meant. Jeryong was not dispatched to welcome promising newcomers. He was the mechanism by which the cult handled people it wanted to assess or remove efficiently. His presence was a statement of expectation. Jeryong came down with 3 sub-officers and the specific energy of someone who had never been required to revise his assumptions at the door. He looked at Yuwon the way a senior person looks at an unknown quantity that has appeared without invitation. Not hostility exactly, but the settled assumption of outcome. He explained that the cult did not admit outsiders who simply arrived at the gate. He noted that the forest clearing time was registered, but that speed through an entry challenge did not establish qualification for the inner ranks. He said several more things in the same register, delivered with the economy of a speech that had been given before. Yuwon asked if there was a test. Jeryong said yes. He would conduct it himself. He was a formidable fighter, not yet a ranker, but positioned just below that threshold with decades of the cult's specific training compressed into his technique. His method was precise and dense, the kind built through accumulated years rather than rapid acquisition. He had a sequential pressure point combination that created a stacking effect which was, against normal floor-level opponents, close to overwhelming. He opened his stance. Yuwon activated gigantification on his right arm and hit him once. The strike was measured, not full application, which would have been considerably worse. It was enough. Jeryong left his feet and landed hard. The impact ran through his technique framework in a way that a lifetime of sequential strike training does not prepare you for, and he lay still for a moment staring at the pale sky. His 3 sub-officers did not move. After a pause that stretched past comfortable, Jeryong sat up. He said nothing for a while. Then he said that the cult leader would want to meet this person directly. Something in his tone had shifted. Not humiliation exactly, but the recalibration of a man who has just encountered information that changes the shape of several things he thought he understood. He led Yuwon up the mountain himself. The trouble arrived halfway up. 2 organizations with presences on the mountain's flanks had been watching the commotion at the threshold. The Sapphire Sword School and the Zhu clan were mid-tier powers on floor 10. Real structures with real membership, but well below the cult's standing and consistently aware of it. Their standard approach to promising newcomers was to extend formal invitations that were, in practice, significantly harder to decline than they initially appeared. A representative from each intercepted Yuwon on the path, the timing close enough between them that the coordination was obvious. The Sapphire Sword School's recruiter was smooth and organized. He outlined the benefits of affiliation, training resources, floor contacts, institutional backing for a solo climber who had not yet established faction relationships. He was speaking to someone he had assessed as a talented newcomer who had cleared the forest fast and would benefit from support. The Zhu clan's representative made a similar pitch in a blunter key. more direct about what declining their invitation tended to mean for solo climbers operating without backing on this particular floor. Yuwon heard them both out. He was about to respond when the mountain path went quiet in the way it goes quiet when something significant is present. Pung Baeklim, the Fist Lord of the Celestial Demon Cult, its highest-ranked combat officer, a ranker of considerable standing, came down the path at a steady pace. He was not a physically imposing man. He was ordinary in almost every visible way, which was precisely the kind of dangerous that took fighters years to learn to read correctly. He looked at the scene, assessed it in one pass, and walked directly to Yuwon. He bowed, not deeply, not with ceremony, a clear and deliberate inclination from a ranker to someone he had decided merited the acknowledgement. Both recruiters went very still. Pung Baeklim said that the cult leader had asked him to escort their guest personally. He addressed Yuwon with a title that implied standing within the cult's structure that neither recruiter had anticipated and that neither of them wanted to publicly dispute in front of a ranker who had just made the power gradient explicit. Both organizations found reasons to be elsewhere. Jaryong, walking slightly behind, appeared to be revising several things at once. The test with Pung Baeklim took place on a flat training ground near the cult's upper compound. The Fist Lord laid out the terms without preamble. 100 lightning strikes, each calibrated just below the structural damage threshold for a floor 10 participant. Yuwon could defend, deflect, or absorb. Survive the full set with his stance intact, and the assessment was complete. Yuwon had catalogued Pung Baeklim's techniques from the previous timeline, tracked them over years, memorized the patterns. He knew the lightning attribute's release rhythm. He knew the three-strike tell that preceded the wide area technique. He knew that when the Fist Lord's weight shifted into his third broad strike, a chest-level gap appeared for less than a second. Knowing all of that, and surviving 100 strikes from a ranker, were still two entirely different problems. The first 10 came fast. He absorbed the first two on his guard, redirected the third using the Cinder Eyes trajectory reading, and took the fourth through sixth in a rolling defense that gave ground deliberately to distribute impact. His arcane channels lit up from the third strike, and stayed that way. He had expected this. He had not fully expected how much it would hurt this early in the set. Strikes 11 through 40 were where the attrition accumulated. Pung Baeklim maintained consistent pressure with the patience of someone who had run this assessment many times and understood exactly what he was measuring. He was watching how Yuwon managed fatigue, not how he performed fresh. The data coming back had shifted his expression very slightly, in the way of a craftsman encountering unexpected material. By strike 60, several had landed partially clean on his left side. He redistributed his weight rightward and adjusted how he was reading the incoming rhythm, trading positional elegance for structural efficiency. 70, 80. The set was cumulative in a way that resisted full preparation, each impact layering onto what the ones before had already done. He was running on structure now, not reserves. The 98th strike came with the three-strike tell he had been watching the entire time. He took it deliberately on the shoulder, eating the impact to shift his body position for what was coming 2 strikes later. The pain was notable. He filed it. The 99th he parried, a full redirect, pushing the lightning discharge sideways and loading his right arm with the redirected energy as the motion rolled through. From a distance, it might have looked like a stumble. The 100th was the wide area technique. Pung Baeklim opened his stance, and his weight went forward, and the gap appeared at chest level exactly where memory said it would be. Yuwon was already moving. His right hand, carrying the redirected charge from the 99th strike, found Pung Baeklim's chest in the narrow window between technique activation and impact. The Fist Lord took one step back. He stopped. A long moment passed. He looked at his own chest, then at Yuwon, with the expression of someone encountering a problem they have not previously had occasion to consider. He said that in 30 years of conducting this assessment, the counter had landed twice. He asked who had trained Yuwon. Yuwon told him no one in particular. Pung Baeklim accepted this without pushing. He awarded the Celestial Demon Spirit, the cult's core martial technique, a method for materializing arcane energy into physical constructs capable of autonomous combat behavior, pressure strikes, and crushing close-range application. A technique not given to anyone outside the cult's highest tier, developed over decades by the original practitioner and refined by those who came after. Yuwon received it and memorized the full framework in one session, He had learned it before, in a timeline that no longer existed. The final test required nothing of the kind. The sacred fire lived in the cult's inner sanctum, a chamber constructed around the flame, not to contain it, but to give it a fixed address. The flame was old enough that its origin was inferred rather than recorded. It fed on fear. In the presence of genuine threat response, it manifested as something approaching destruction. In the presence of something it could find no fear in, it responded differently. Cheon Mujin, the cult leader, who had been watching Yuwon's progress since his arrival with the focused quiet of someone who had long since stopped prejudging what he saw, explained the condition plainly. The flame required no technique, no specific arcane preparation. You either entered or you did not, and what followed was a function of what you were, not what you could perform. He said that most who attempted it did not clear the entrance. Yuwon walked in. The sacred fire was not like ordinary flame. Ordinary flame had a relationship with what it burned. It consumed, it responded, it behaved according to the chemistry of fuel and air. The sacred fire looked at what stood before it and manifested in proportion to what it found. Yuwon had stood at the apex of the tower beside a god who was dissolving into nothing and watched the last of humanity fall one by one. He had lived through the actual end of everything and chosen to do it again from the beginning. The sacred fire reached toward him and found no purchase. It changed instead. The absorption remade the channel it moved through, settling into his arcane system as something that would now express itself outward, through the fear of those he faced, rather than inward. A flame that would grow with his opponent's dread and not require any of his own. He walked out the other side with fire where there had been only mana. Cheon Mujin was waiting at the chamber's edge. He looked at Yuwon for a moment, and what had been focused attention became something else. The recognition that sits differently than assessment and does not require explanation. He named Yuwon Vice Lord of the Celestial Demon Cult. Jiaryong, standing among the senior officers present, received this information with the expression of a man who had been revising the same first impression all afternoon and was still not finished. He said nothing. He bowed. Yuwon accepted the title, noted what it would mean for the Sapphire Sword School representatives if they crossed his path again, and began thinking about what Floor 11 required. The examiner running Floor 11 was named Hypnos. He was an Olympian officer who had been given jurisdiction over the floor's trial system, and he had been using that jurisdiction as a tool for quietly eliminating Olympus's competition for years. He would already know Yuwon was coming. He would have been watching since the Colosseum result, and he would have a plan. Floor 11's trial framework was built around flags. Each team received a set, and the mechanic was standard. Take more flags than the opposing team before the time limit closed. Straightforward retrieval combat, the kind of test designed to measure coordination and fighting quality under pressure. Hypnos had modified the parameters considerably. Yuwon arrived at the assignment board to find his team. 51 participants, himself included, drawn from players the examiner had pre-selected as isolated, underconnected, or flagged for quiet elimination. The opposing team numbered 200. Not a mild imbalance, a number large enough that the trial's official documentation would record it as technically within permissible variance, while being, in practical terms, a predetermined outcome. Hypnos had been running this pattern for years. 32 prior trials under his administration, and the numbers told the same story every time. Promising players connected to factions Olympus found inconvenient consistently drew the short side, and consistently lost. Yuwon studied the board for 4 seconds, then went to find his team. They were a scattered group, no established connections between them, some still adjusting to the floor's systems, a handful of genuinely capable fighters who had simply been cut off from the networks that would have otherwise supported them. They looked at the 200 count with expressions that ranged from calculated concern to barely managed dread. He told them to hold positions at the rear of their flag storage. He told them not to move forward. He was going forward alone. Nangong-hoon commanded the opposing 200 with the structured efficiency of someone who had prepared for exactly this kind of assignment. He was the Nangong clan's prodigy, a real talent with years of investment behind him, and a faction that had not spared resources in his development. His plan was sound: organize into layered subunits, establish perimeter control early, then compress toward the enemy position in coordinated waves that could absorb losses without losing structural integrity. Against a 4-to-1 numbers advantage, it was close to textbook. He sent his 40-man vanguard forward first, buffed and synchronized. Yuwon let the sacred fire surface. The flame did not manifest as an attack. It manifested as presence, a concentrated quality of threat so specific and immediate that it registered before conscious assessment could engage, in the older parts of the brain that have no interest in tactical analysis. The 40 fighters entered the field with their coordination intact, and within seconds found that maintaining it had become unexpectedly difficult, without being able to identify why. Their buffed captain pushed through the initial disruption and threw his full technique directly at Yuwon. The sacred fire fed on what he brought with him. 3 went down in the first exchange. 7 more dropped out of formation in the following minute, not from direct contact but from proximity to a flame that grew proportionally with every person present who was not entirely without hesitation. Roel, the vanguard captain, outlasted the others through sheer will. He landed real strikes. They cost him substantially more than he recovered from them. The vanguard surrendered their flags at 16 minutes. Nangong-hoon had been watching from the rear, with the careful attention of someone who updates their model when the evidence requires it. He had watched 40 coordinated and prepared fighters lose internal coherence in the presence of one opponent who appeared to be working without significant effort. He ran the arithmetic on what his remaining count looked like against that variable and arrived at a conclusion that wounded pride, but that clear thinking had already accepted. He sent a messenger forward with his team's flags at 18 minutes. When Yuwon reached him, Nangong-hoon was standing with the settled posture of someone who had already finished grieving a decision and come out the other side. He said he forfeited not because he lacked the numbers, but because he was not willing to spend 200 participants' physical condition to satisfy his own accounting of what a result should look like. Yuwon told him that was a reasonable position. Nangong-hoon held his gaze and said he expected they would meet again at higher floors. He said it without resentment, as a statement of intention, clean and forward-looking. Yuwon said that was also a reasonable expectation. Hypnos had a secondary plan, because Hypnos always had a secondary plan. The examiner's core skill was illusion, a technique refined over decades into something that could generate a fully enclosed false reality around a sleeping target. Inside the construct, the target experienced whatever Hypnos built. Outside it, they were simply unconscious. An unconscious participant in a trial context was not protected by the tower's standard rules governing examiner conduct, and Hypnos had learned exactly where the procedural language left room to operate. He moved on Yuwon the night between the trial result and the formal first-place award, in the narrow window before automatic administrative review would activate. He had used this window before. It had always been sufficient. Yuwon was not asleep. He was in a rest position, different. The Kaini ran at low passive output as a matter of habit, its dark mana cycling through his arcane channels as an ambient monitoring layer. Hephaestus had mentioned this function once, in a single sentence at handover, between other technical specifications. Yuwon had filed it. When Hypnos deployed the illusion framework around him, the Kaini registered the dark attribute intrusion into his channel space immediately. He let the illusion seal. He stayed inside it long enough for Hypnos to commit fully, moving toward Yuwon's physical position in real space, confident in the access he believed he had constructed. Then Yuwon activated Kaini's stealth layer inside the construct's own architecture, sliding through the illusion's spatial logic using the same dark mana frequency the construct ran on. He came through behind Hypnos in the real room. The examiner heard the displacement and turned. What crossed his face in that half-second was the specific expression produced by understanding, too late and too completely, that the geometry of a trap has been reversed. Yuwon drove the Twilight Blade through the channel junction the Cinder Eyes had already mapped, the convergence point where Hypnos' illusion technique drew its power, where a precise insertion would collapse the framework and drop the examiner simultaneously. Hypnos hit the floor. He was still conscious, and his eyes were already calculating. He began assembling the formal argument: examiner authority, trial context, the claim that a participant striking a tower-appointed examiner constituted a violation that superseded the circumstances of the encounter. He did not finish it. The light in the room changed. The Floor 11 administrator was simply present. No entrance, no approach. The way administrators always arrived when something had drawn their full attention. The air pressure shifted. Yuwon had felt this before and knew to be still. The administrator looked at Hypnos on the floor. He looked at the trial records flagged for review, and at 32 previous trials laid beside them. and at the pattern those numbers produced when examined against the Olympian Assessment Network's activity logs. What followed was not a hearing. No counter-argument was solicited. The administrator processed the available evidence with the speed of something that did not think the way humans think, and delivered his conclusion in specific, terminal terms. Hypnos' examiner authority was revoked. His divine powers were bound. His arcane channels were sealed to a fraction of their previous capacity. His sentence was specified in a number that made the room go completely quiet. Then the administrator hit him, once, into the stone floor, with the casual application of force that represents absolute authority not bothering to measure itself against the target, and was gone. Hypnos lay embedded in the floor. He was alive. He would remain alive for a very long time under conditions he had not considered when he designed his operation. The formal result arrived the following morning. First place, 22,360 points. Yuwon collected it, noted the figure, and started thinking about Floor 20. The Grand Martial Arts Tournament ran on Floor 10's central arena under the Celestial Demon Cult's banner, and drew participants from every major faction on the floor. The prize was the Great Scarlet Medicinal Sphere, a cultivation resource that accelerated arcane development at a potency well above anything available through standard floor rewards. Yuwon needed it. His arcane power sat just below the 100 threshold, and at 100, Sensory Field became available, a domain-class perception ability that extended awareness outward across a radius large enough to reframe the tactical picture of every encounter above this floor. He registered and entered the Battle Royale among approximately 200 participants, and he spent the early hours managing his output deliberately downward. He let the field thin on its own. Stronger participants handled the weaker ones. Mid-tier clusters formed and dissolved. He held his monoread at a level that flagged as capable without drawing specific attention, and he waited. Hargan found him in the third hour. He had worked through his bracket with the directness that characterized everything he did. Frontal, efficient, genuinely impressive. He spotted Yuwon at the arena's eastern edge and walked straight toward him with his gold attribute technique already forming. He said he had been looking forward to this specific encounter since Baraganda Island. He said it with real pleasure and no performance. Yuwon told him the feeling was mutual. Hargan opened with his full sequence, a rapid lightning flurry calibrated to pressure opponents into defensive postures where his gold-hardened close strikes became decisive. He had ended every serious fight he had entered with this combination, at this floor, at this stage of development. It was not a gamble, it was a proven instrument. Yuwon parried the first 3 strikes. The 4th, 5th, and 6th he redirected, giving ground deliberately. Hargan read the retreating movement as hesitation and pressed his weight forward into the rhythm. Yuwon activated gigantification and swung once. Hargan left the arena floor entirely. He cleared the boundary line and came down at the 3rd row of spectator barrier, which absorbed the impact with a structural shudder. He lay still for a moment with the specific quality of stillness that follows a significant physical event and an ongoing internal inventory. Then he sat up and laughed. Not bitterly and not for show. A genuine laugh. The sound of someone who has just understood something clearly and found the understanding more satisfying than painful. He called out from the boundary that Yuwon owed him a real fight someday, and that he intended to collect on it. Yuwon said he would keep the space open. He cleared the remaining bracket without extending himself, collected the Great Scarlet Medicinal Sphere, and consumed it on the walk out of the arena. His arcane power crossed 100. The sensory field opened. It expanded outward from his position across the full arena and the districts beyond. A continuous sphere of awareness that tracked movement, arcane signatures, physical mass, and the energy output of everything within range at once. He stood in the emptied arena and adjusted to the volume of information a world contains when you can actually perceive all of it. It was considerably more than it had appeared to be from the outside. Floor 20 was an ocean, not a floor with an ocean on it, a floor that was primarily ocean, a vast body of water interrupted by island chains and underwater geography that the floor's native population had built their civilization around over centuries of isolation. The giants had retreated here after the Gigantomachia. They had not invited the tower's climbing population to join them, and the tower's climbing population had largely respected this without being asked twice. Yuwon arrived at Neptune Island during the lead-up to the floor's trial season. Young giants moved supplies near the port. enormous compared to human scale, careful with each other in the easy way of communities that have spent a long time in close quarters. One of them dropped a loaded crate near the dock's edge and caught it before it went over, then stood holding it and looking embarrassed in a way that translated across the size difference without difficulty. Yuwon helped him set it right. The giant looked down at him with the expression his kind reserved for unexpected human behavior and said something in his own language. His companion translated. He was saying the human was surprisingly useful for his size. Yuwon accepted this without comment. Elder Urfa found him that evening. She was ancient even by giant reckoning, old enough that her physical presence had become something separate from combat standing, a symbol of accumulated time rather than active power. She moved slowly and looked at Yuwon with eyes that had been reading intentions for longer than most current tower residents had been alive. She asked what he wanted. He told her, the sea stone, the fragment of Poseidon's trident that had settled in the deepest trench of this floor's ocean during the aftermath of a war the giants remembered differently than Olympus's history recorded. Urfa was quiet for a while. She said that Olympus had been sending envoys for generations, that every one of them had made the same argument. The stone was Poseidon's, the giants were holding what was not theirs, cooperation would be rewarded, and the alternative would be noted. She said that none of those envoys had mentioned the Gigantomachia by name or acknowledged what it had actually cost. She asked if he knew. Yuwon told her about Hephaestus, the forge on the first floor, the weapons built in good faith and turned on the people they were made alongside. The fire between them had burned considerably lower by the time she spoke again. She told him where the sea stone rested. She said it without ceremony, as if the decision had been made some time before this conversation, and this was simply the moment of its expression. The trial that unsealed the colossal sea turtle was a dive. Breach the trench, locate a sealed formation on the ocean floor, and recover what was inside before the formation collapsed. The system listed it as a combat trial. The accurate description required more specificity. Penetrate the outer shell of a creature so large that its dorsal surface constituted navigable geography. Fight through everything the creature's biology had developed inside it over centuries of dormancy, and destroy the mana heart at its center. Yuwon went over the side of the boat and down. The descent moved through water that darkened differently than depth alone explained. Mana saturated, pressing against vision and arcane channels simultaneously. He ran Kaine's stealth layer to reduce his signature, and pushed toward the trench floor at full speed. The containment lattice dissolved when he reached it. The sea turtle woke. The outer shell activated, as living things activate. Reactive, territorial, immediate. Monster variants that had spent centuries dormant inside the shell's structure poured outward through access points that opened as the creature's biology re-engaged. The first wave was density rather than quality, hundreds of them filling the water in every direction without coordination. He discharged the invocation of hell. The Kaine released its accumulated dark mana in a concentrated spherical wave that moved through the water without the resistance that conventional energy encounters in a liquid medium. Dark mana operated on different physics. The volume cleared. He moved forward through what remained and went deeper, into the shell's interior passages. The inside of the sea turtle was its own ecosystem, chambers connected by organic passages that the creature's biology had grown around over centuries. Walls of living material pulsing with slow bioluminescence, intersections opening into caverns where the floor dropped further and the mana pressure increased in layers. 4-chamber sequences, each requiring a different answer to the defensive structures the creature had developed around the route to its core. The mana heart sat at the center. It was enormous. Not a conventional organ, but a concentrated nexus of divine-class water energy. The functional core of a creature built from Poseidon's fragment power. It was aware of him. He felt its awareness pressing against the sensory field, something vast and old examining the intruder it had detected, with the calm attention of a thing that had not previously had reason to consider itself threatened. He hit it with everything stacked at once. The invocation discharged again at close range. The twilight blade went into the seam the Cinder Eyes identified as the heart's structural boundary. The giant arm drove the strike through the outer resistance the heart generated against physical force. He held that point of contact for 3 full seconds, against a pressure that pushed back with the weight of a divine-class entity that did not want to stop existing. The heart broke. The creature above went still. The ocean registered the absence of something that had been present within it for centuries. He found the sea stone in the collapsed remains, a fragment of deep blue that threw no light, that commanded the water around it simply by existing, the way genuine authority commands a room without raising its voice. He closed his hand around it and started upward. Theseus had arrived during the dive. Poseidon's son stood on the bow of an Olympian fleet lead vessel, with the expression of someone who had done his timing correctly and expected the situation to resolve in his favor. He was Floor 20's designated trial examiner, a ranker with complete domain over water attribute mana, and a man whose relationship with his father's recognition had been the organizing principle of his ambitions long enough that it had stopped being a motivation and become a structural feature of how he operated. He raised his hand and the ocean responded. Water attribute domain at ranker level was not a technique. It was a negotiation between the user and the medium, with the user holding the stronger position. The sea around the dive point compressed and rose, a column of consolidated water aimed at eliminating whatever came up through it. Yuwon surfaced through the column. He had the sea stone in one hand and his arcane channels aligned with it. In the 3 seconds between surface and Theseus's technique completing, he ran the fragment's authority against the local domain and pushed. The sea stone did not compete with Theseus's water control. It superseded it. Not through superior output, through inheritance. A fragment of Poseidon's trident carried authority over water attribute mana that predated and exceeded any practitioner's skill, regardless of their standing. The domain dissolved from below. The column fell back into ocean. Theseus felt his technique leave him in real time, which was an experience he had never previously encountered and for which his development had not prepared him. He tried to reassert. The sea stone was already speaking to everything within range that carried water attribute resonance. Leviathan surfaced first. The sea beast answered the fragment's call as a disturbance in the horizon before it became visible as a shape, an entity whose existence had been oriented around this frequency for its entire life and which had simply been waiting for the correct signal. More followed, high-tier sea creatures breaching around the Olympian fleet at distances that communicated the situation without requiring elaboration. Surtur came across the water from the shoreside. His fire ran the surface without quenching. A fire that belonged to a being native to flame moves through a medium with the ease of something that was never subject to it in the first place. The Olympian backup fighters pulled toward the lead ship. Theseus stood at his bow and looked at what surrounded him. The stone, the sea beasts, the fire giant moving unhurried across the water, the young climber who had gone into the trench and come back up commanding things that answered to him as a matter of structural priority rather than technique. He retreated to Apollo's sun chariot, which had been standing by offshore for an exit he had not expected to need. The fleet withdrew. The sea monsters held the perimeter until the last Olympian ship cleared the horizon, then settled into a circling pattern around the island chain that showed no sign of dispersing on its own schedule. Urfa stood on the shore when Yuwon came in. She looked at the horizon where the fleet had been and was quiet for a long time. Then she said the giants had not previously had a visitor produce that particular outcome. Surtur, still running fire off his forearms, said he found the entire situation excellent. The forge on floor 1 looked the same from outside as it always did. Inside, Hephaestus turned the sea stone over with the focus of a craftsman encountering unfamiliar material, looking for what could be worked with and what it would cost, and what the process would actually require. He set it on the workbench and pulled up a stool and looked at it without speaking for a while. He told Yuwon it would take 10 days. He said refining a divine fragment into a functional artifact required techniques he had not touched in a long time, applied to material that would resist the process because it was not designed to be worked. It was a piece of divine inheritance, not a raw resource, and the distinction presented itself at every stage of refinement. He also said that when the work began, Poseidon would know. Zeus would know. The informal pressure Olympus had been running through proxies and corrupt examiners on the lower floors would stop being informal within days of the first strike on the forge. Yuwon told him he understood. Hephaestus said understanding and accepting were different things, and looked at him until it was clear Yuwon meant both. He picked up the sea stone and carried it to the inner work surface, already somewhere else in the way craftsmen go somewhere else when the real work begins. Over his shoulder, without turning around, He mentioned that there were diamonds available through certain floor vendors that would be worth collecting before the climb continued upward. He said it the way he said most things, flat, specific, like a technical specification. Yuwon stepped outside into the floor's air. 2 divine fragments secured, one still somewhere above, and a 10-day window before Olympus stopped working around him and started working directly against him. He pulled out a list and started adding to it.